Thank you, Andrew Mcintyre, for joining us and willing to give your testimony to the International Tribunal for Natural Justice. Before we do start, can you take the oath, please, Andrew?
Yes, I can do that. I, Andrew Mcintyre, solemnly affirm by all that is sacred and righteous that my testimony is given freely and without coercion and is the truth, the whole truth, nothing but the truth, so help me God.
Thank you for swearing the oath, Andrew. Where would you like to start with your testimony?
Well, it's a long story. I will eventually be sending my stat decks over to you, so you can see that I've actually my sisters and I have been trying to have old cases solved. We were witnesses to abductions and murders back in the 50s, 60s and 70s. My father was extremely well connected through the public service, and even back in the 50s and 60s, the networking of the pedophiles here went right through the public service, medical, legal, the police force, politicians, the whole lot. And I have a lot of knowledge of this, and so do my, well, I had two sisters. One was murdered, and the rest of us are still alive. Rachel's from my father's second marriage, so I'm quite a bit older than Rachel. I know the 50s, 60s, that's what I'm involved in, early 70s, and Rachel, unfortunately, was left with my father when I left home. But you asked me some questions, and I can answer anything you like. Otherwise, I won't know what direction you want to lead me in, what you'd like.
Thank you. I think you started quite well. But firstly, you say my sisters. Can you just tell us the names of your sisters and roughly when they were born and their ages?
Right. Well, I'm the middle child of my father's first marriage, and there's my younger sister Ruth, about 1.5 years younger than myself. I'm just about to turn 65. Claire, my older sister, was about a year older than myself. She's been deceased since 2008. 2009, basically.
Okay. So you have two sisters, Ruth and Claire?
Yes. And then from my father's second marriage, there's Rachel is the youngest sibling, and I have a brother and sister from my father's second marriage that I don't really have anything to do with.
And you say you have a sister who's deceased now. Which one is the deceased sister?
Claire was the firstborn of the first marriage. She died a day after going to police to make testimony about my father and his associates' abduction and murder of the Beaumont children.
Okay, well, we will get to that. Let's start talking chronological order, if that's okay with you. So you said you're witness to abuses in the 50s and 60s.
Yes, I am.
Yeah. Let's start there.
Well,
can you tell us first recollection and when?
My first recollection of my father's bad behaviour was when I was still in nappies. My mother wasn't home. She may have been in hospital giving birth to my younger sister, but he pulled me up out of the cot, and this is pretty awful, removed my nappy and put a rag with ether or chloroform on it, which was suffocating me. Then he proceeded to try to rape me, and I was only a baby. My other sisters received the same treatment from my father. He liked to abuse babies because in comments made by him later in life, they couldn't remember. That's what he based all of his child abuse over. But any child under four years old couldn't remember being sexually assaulted. That's a fact.
Can you tell us your father's name?
Alan Maxwell Mcintyre.
And you say you were a baby when this happened first?
Yes, I was. That's right. And then there were other occasions. Up to the age of 13 was the last time that my father tried to sexually assault me. By the age of 13, I was able to fight him off, and it was a terrible, distressing experience. My father is a terrible person. He's recently deceased.
When did he die?
13th of June 2017.
Now let's move on from there. You say that he was. So this is the 50s. Can you talk about the 60s as well? But let's talk about. So how long does abuse carry on for with you? With
me till I was 13. There wasn't much abuse from my father. It was more physical abuse, beatings, psychological. They just traumatized you. As a child, you were groomed, conditioned, and traumatized. I mean, you start to realize how unusual my childhood was when you become an adult yourself and have your own children, right? But with my father, he was networking with a lot of people through the 50s and the 60s. His part-time job was grave digger. Therefore, and it's well documented here that they had access to corpses, and he took us along to a morgue in the city when we were little kids and showed us how to select a good corpse. We're children, like we're 5 years old, 4 years old, and we're taken into a morgue where he's showing us how you select a good body. My father and others at the time were robbing graves. They were selling, it's quite well documented. You could buy anything from mortuary porters. You just put in an order and they got the parts for you, right? That's just the way it was.
So you say that there was a network with a lot of people involved?
Yes.
How do you know there was a network?
Sorry. My father worked for Telecom, Telstra, which is a telephone, our major telephone company here, which is now being privatised.
Yeah.
But he had his friends. He had friends who were doctors, police. He had a lot of police friends. He had friends who were very high-ranking police officers. Yet my father was not a member of the police force.
Channel 9.
We had a lot of association with Channel 9 here in Adelaide, which now was full of pedophiles. There have been quite a few people that worked for Channel 9 that have been prosecuted for being pedophiles, but not really dealt with harshly. Pedophiles have been very looked after here in South Australia. I recently had an offender jailed, and a second one is now in prison. I am doing something. You can see me on the internet if you look up anything to do with the Beaumont case. I spent a lot of time in court, and I've made quite a few statements, interviews in the press. But as soon as I start saying something about SAPOL, the whole thing shut down, and it's never aired. So I've made quite a few statements. I was part of a television program here, but as soon as I was interviewed and I answered questions about SAPOL, the whole series was shut down.
Okay.
That's just the way it is.
What is SAPOL?
South Australian Police Force.
Yeah. Why do you think everything shuts down when you start mentioning that?
Why do I think that there's Sorry.
Why did it cut you off when you start mentioning Safehold?
Well, if you're a television here and news, I would say 80% of anything that you can broadcast comes from Safehold, comes from the police. If you were to upset anybody in Safehold, you pretty much shut down your television station or your radio station. More television, because you get the police reports on traffic accidents, floods, disasters, murders, bank robberies, anything. It all comes through Safehold. It's just
Why don't you think they want you to talk about?
Well, I'll tell you. My father explained to his children. He would tell us about bad policemen. It was always them and not him. Pedophiles. He always pointed the finger at other people. But he basically, there were people in the police force back when I was a child who were pedophiles. And back in South Australia, in the 50s and 60s, it wasn't a crime to have sex or rape children. It wasn't an offence. That's a fact. It wasn't a criminal act.
It was considered bestiality.
It was called buggery, I think. And it didn't even get a slap on the wrist with a wet tram ticket, unfortunately. And when I went witness against a pedophile here, Anthony Munro, who's now in prison, I was very fortunate that we were able to have him prosecuted for crimes back in the 60s because of the laws then. And I won't go on about it, but they even tell us here in South Australia how these pedophiles are fine, upstanding men with morally correct and everything, and it just makes you sick. I won't go into it, but it's very distressing. Anyway, Anthony Munro was charged. He was given 18 years, and then because he's such a top bloke, that was reduced to 5 years. It's the way it is here. It's very hard to get a conviction. But basically, my father had a lot of friends in the police force, and they did things that weren't right. We as children were offered up to his doctor friends for any experiments they wanted to perform on us. We were involved in child pornography, experimental medicine, you name it. That's what happened. Because my father didn't care about his children. He was a psychopath. He told my sister Ruth, my younger sister, that he only had children and a family as a cover, as a disguise for what he did. So he could have two lives, the family man with children, etc., and then the other life, basically. My father would abduct children, and I'll say this, he used to source his children from the orphanages. They were simply taken out and they were crossed off the list, and then they disappeared. They preyed upon children. In the Mulligan inquiry that we had in South Australia, which has had an 80-year gag put on it, about 900 odd pedophiles were named. Their names have been suppressed. More than about 600 children were reported missing from I think it was the Goodwood orphanage where he used to source his children from, and we're not allowed to know anything about it, okay? Well, my father used to take them to our house right from the late 50s right through to 1965, and he would butcher them in a wooden house down the back. And he would sell their body parts to a friend of his who was the chief surgeon at the Queen Elizabeth Hospital. Somebody a young bloke in the skin diving club was going out with his daughter. I know these things. I used to go to the parties, etc. when I was a kid. Now, basically my father was selling body parts, but my father had his other reasons. I think he was collecting things. He always had a field surgical bag that he would roll out with scalpels and stitching stuff and everything. And from what I've been told from one of my siblings, he would perform surgery on these poor children before he would kill them. I have credibility here in South Australia. If you look me up on the internet, I tell the truth. Now, from the early 60s to 1965, when the butchering operation was shifted to a building not far from where we lived, I would have to, on a weekly basis, burn the remains of these children. And there may have been some adults, I don't know, but body parts, I used to have to burn them in a furnace every week. And we're talking, this went on for years. You think about the figures of the amount of body parts remains that I burnt in the furnace. I could smell burning hair. It was awful, right? But I didn't know what I was burning. But one day our cat got into the furnace and opened up some of the parcels for the meat that was inside. So I took the parcels out and I laid them down on the ground and I opened up everything, and I had like a medium-sized person's skeleton all cut up. The hands, the head and the feet were missing. Everything else was there. The backbone had been cut right down the middle, probably to make it look like a side of lamb. The flesh was fresh because my father was also processing these bodies, and him and his friends were eating them, eating the human flesh. And that's a fact. That's what they were doing. It was part of their religion or their cult or something, consuming human flesh. Now, this was a fresh kill. Don't know who it was, but it was obviously a child, not an adult. I showed my father and he told me, he wrapped it all up, he put it back in the furnace. He said, Andrew, don't you ever look in the furnace again. There might be bullets in there. Can you believe it? So I had to get a container of petrol, a plastic ice cream container of petrol, throw it in there and stand back and throw a match in from a distance. I was never allowed to look in the furnace. Next week, when I burnt the next body, you know, I didn't know what I was doing until I was an adult. But there was a packet of bullets in there and they blew up in my face. And I had lead, molten lead hit me in the face, and it ran down my shirt and burnt me. And I looked up and he was just standing there with a big grin on his face. And I said, Dad, there's bullets in the fire. And he just turned around and walked off. That's the way it was. In 1963, a friend of his called Anthony Munro, who I've recently had convicted in jail because he was doing things to me that he shouldn't have when I was a child, but I didn't fear him the way I feared my father. Now, he went out with a lad, a friend of mine, I won't mention his name, and they used to pick up bodies for my father and bring them back in the boot of my father's car. My father had 2 American Fords with big boots, and he had 2. This is back when we didn't have much money in Australia. He was using these cars for transporting bodies, so he'd always have a car to use, but he had one out picking up bodies, right? And my mother heard the car come back and she said, Andrew, go and get the travelling rug from the boot. I ran out, pulled the boot up, and there were 2 dead children in the boot in 1963. One was a girl. She was they must have been in sheets, I'd say, that they use in hospitals then. One was a light blue. The smaller child was in a light blue sheet. And the older girl, who would have been at least 12, who went from one side of the boot to the other, was in a light greenish sheet. I pulled the sheet apart where her face was, and there she was looking at me. I ran inside and grabbed my mother. I nearly dragged her off her feet. and I dragged her out. By that time, and my sister Ruth had been made to stand there and wait for the car to come back. She was always a witness. Everybody in the driveway, and that's the father's skin diving mates, two men that I didn't recognise that he told Ruth were policemen plain clothes. Whether they were or not, I don't know, but I didn't know them. They pulled the bodies out of one car and threw them in the boot of the other car, and then they all sat on the back of the car. That's a fact. It's just normal behaviour. That's what normally happened. There were bodies brought to our house all the time. And in the Mulligan inquiry, they came up with 600 missing children from the Goodwood orphanage. There are a lot of people here in Adelaide that are trying to have that lifted, politicians, etc., because they want to know who the pedophiles are, some 900 of them, and who the 600 children were. Now, my father used to make pornographic movies with these children that he'd take out of the orphanage. Now, I wasn't there, but my sisters were. And there were animals involved, like dogs, etc. The children spoke with English accents. You know, we're all, you know, basically from England back in those days. And then Italians and Greeks came over after the Second World War, and we became a bit more multicultural. But these children had English accents, and they were being used in child pornography, just taken out of the orphanage for the weekend. There were people with professional cameras, lighting equipment, those umbrellas that open up to diffuse light, full on child pornography. And that was normal. And there'd be police coming to our house. They were friends of my father. 100 metres from our house was Chief Inspector Vogelsang, who had a son. A friend of mine I went to school with, his father was a high-ranking policeman. My father moved with very high-ranking policemen. And when it came to the Beaumont abductions, I'll send you a statement so you can read it. My father deliberately used policemen's sons in the abduction and murder of the Beaumont children. He said he stitched them up. He had them in the palm of his hand for the rest of his life. He had immunity to prosecution.
Now, can you explain that? Can you explain about the Beaumont children? Can you amplify?
Okay, I'll explain the Beaumont children.
Yep.
On the day that they went missing, my father, it's better that you read it in the statement, but basically they were brought to our house in the boot of my father's car by Anthony Munro. There's a statement in the Advertiser where my father stated that Anthony Munro brought the Beaumont children to his house in the boot of his car that afternoon of Australia Day, 1966. We all saw them. Well, I was kept down the back, but eventually I managed to get to the front. And you know what? We had men in suits directing traffic at each end of the street while my father performed some touch-up work on the 3 dead children in the boot of his car. And if you really need to know, the little boy had his penis severed, and my father stitched it on back to front. Now, he would have done that deliberately for some reason, but I know where the Beaumont children are buried because Anthony Munro showed me, because he was in fear of being murdered by my father as an adult, I realise now. 2 weeks after the children went missing, Anthony Munro drove me at high speed over to my grandfather's property at Stansbury, and the sinkhole there, which we called the well, had just been filled in. Disguised completely, you wouldn't have even known that it had been there, okay? So my grandfather, unfortunately, was pulled into this whole thing. My father knew what was going on, and so did SAPOL. They knew what was going on because my father used their sons in the whole thing. It's pretty bizarre, isn't it? I've made a full statement in 2011. And then I upgraded that in 2015 because I remembered going over to Stansbury 2 weeks afterwards. What happened was my father took the children down to a reservoir down south from Adelaide, and he kept them there for about a week and a bit in the water, and then he moved them to Stansbury. But he also had 3 wards of state that he murdered in the same week. He took 3 children out of the Goodwood orphanage that looked like the Beaumont Children. He dressed them to look like the Beaumont Children, dyed their hair, etc. And he walked them around all over Adelaide. He thought it was a real joke. Just so, that's why we have reports of the Beaumont Children were still alive, because there were sightings of them. He deliberately did that. Then he took them down south and in front of my sister Ruth, threw them off a cliff. And it was a day when there was a busload or a couple of busloads of children from the orphanage down there. And Ruth looked over the side of the cliff, and there were 3 children laying on the beach. 3 people walked up and they walked off with them. Okay, so SAPOL know all of this. And the problem with SAPOL is my father was a very clever man. I hate him, but he covered himself by, I think, put the 3 wards of state in the same hole as the Beaumont Children. So the police can never dig up the Beaumont Children, because then they have to explain the 3 missing children. And that were never reported missing. And they're part of the 600 children who are missing from the Goodwood orphanage. It goes on and on and on. Now,
and the Mulligan inquiry.
Yes.
Mulligan inquiry dealt with the issue with the disappearances of the children in the orphanage. Is that right?
It dealt with the wards of state. My sister Ruth was involved in that. She was a major player in that. Wendy Rolls was another woman who was involved in it. And they have been hounded by SAPOL. They have been just treated very badly. And so I've been treated badly as well. When I first came, I mean, I haven't even been able to work for a year and a half. I had to retire early just to try to sort this out. In the meantime, I've had a couple of people put in prison. Big deal. I'm trying to dig up these children. I know where I saw them buried. Getting back to Macklin Street, the family home, my father would, in front of Ruth, my sister and myself, and the other one who's now dead, would rake the bones out of the furnace every couple or 3 weeks or so and bury them in shallow holes. And he'd crack jokes about blood and bones good for the garden. You know, like he was always saying things, you know, like he used to tell Ruth everything he did. Me, I was always on the outside. I wasn't really being told what was going on, but I saw a lot. And where he would bury these bones, because back in those days, they didn't have DNA testing. So, you know, there were fingerprints, there were blood types, but really it was very primitive. So he thought by burning everything in the furnace, it was all taken care of. And then he'd put a beehive on top of where he would bury bodies or whatever in the yard. He had 2 beehives. He'd put that on there. Nobody'd go near a beehive. And later on, when he moved the beehive to another grave, he'd plant a tree there. You know, he'd plant a tree. The guy was a genius. Why he did all this was that back then, the garbage was collected we put our garbage in tin cans with a lid. The people that picked up, they emptied the contents out into the back of a truck, and then it was compacted after that. You could not throw dead people away in your rubbish bin, because I would say that people worked for the council had to check the garbage when they dumped it, just to make sure that nobody was, you know, that there wasn't a head in the garbage can, right? So my father had to get rid of everything on site. As he built the house, he buried people under the driveway. He buried people in the shed, in the garage. He buried people everywhere. I'm not kidding. And a friend of mine asked him one day why he had different patches in the concrete, because sometimes he'd go back and retrieve a body and move it somewhere else. So then he put another layer of concrete over the top of the shed and the huge driveway. Then he, in the 70s, he went back to retrieve the remains. So then he had to put another layer of concrete through the garage and the driveway. There's 3 layers of concrete on the same driveway, because he had to get rid of all the remains. He was running like a factory at our place. And in South Australia, we're talking about hundreds and hundreds and hundreds of people that were just processed for their body parts. And that's a fact. And I know
how many years do you think this went on for?
He first buried 2 people out in front of the house we're having our sewers put in, right? So he had 2 corpses wrapped up, and he threw them in the deep ditch out the front of our house. It was still not a bitumen road. It was a new suburb. And then the people across the road had their gas put in. So people came along and started digging across to put the gas in above the sewer. And my father made us stand out in the rain one morning, and he pulled 2 decomposed bodies out of the road and then took them down the back because they were going to be found. That's just bad luck. He was a person that was so good at taking opportunities, like the sinkhole at Stansbury. It was just there waiting to be filled in. A hole in the road, a driveway he's putting down, anything like that. I mean, there was even his young mates from the skin diving club, most of them are dead now because he was an older member. They had MG sports cars. And this is just another example. And I've written about all these things. They had a teenage girl that they'd booked out from the orphanage for the weekend. She fell out of the car and died. They used to race all the time, no seatbelts. Well, Max had the body processed, got them to bring it around to our house. Ruth, my sister, was standing there hiding in the bushes to watch. Max had dug a hole where the shed floor was going to be. They all put all the body parts in there and ran off. They were terrified. Next day, they all came along and they were standing over this girl's remains. And I walked up. They didn't see me. I was only about 10 years old. I walked up between them and I heard everything they were talking about. They're talking about how horrible it was, how she fell out of the car, died. And she was buried there. And the smell was terrible. The neighbours were complaining. Then it rained and it all got wet and the smell was horrendous. And then my father put concrete over it. But before that, I was out there, I'd forgotten all about, the conversation with the boys and that, didn't fully understand what they were talking about. These were teenage men, in their middle to later teens or middle teens. And I was digging a hole in the sand where the body was. And my father came out and he looked really upset. And that's the last thing I remember. I woke up delirious, having hallucinations. He tried to poison me. And he left me in a bed down in the lounge room away from everybody else to die. And I just lucky I got through it. So my father used to try to kill his own children with a clear conscience. It didn't bother him. Rachel here, when she was 3 years old, because he raped Rachel when she was 3 and Ruth, 3 or 4, cut them with a scalpel and anally raped them. And in Ruth's case, he had a camera crew there filming it. Bizarre. And he had his doctor friend there. And my sister Ruth nearly hemorrhaged to death. I was there. I walked into the bathroom and she was sitting in a hand basin filled with blood, bright red and bleeding out. He picked me up and he threw me out of the room and ordered me out of the house. Now, my sister Ruth And my father had the same blood type, which was a rare blood type. And this doctor, he used to call him Dr. Feeble because he was a really skinny guy. He was completely dominated by my father, did a blood transfusion on the spot, on the bathroom floor between the two of them, apparently, and she didn't die. But Rachel here, after he raped Rachel, she was sitting on the front lawn with her dog. She's 3 or 4 years old, and I knew this happened.
I was
5. Okay. He drove in the driveway, looks at her, goes off the driveway straight across the front lawn and drove straight over the top of her with a large car, tried to kill her. Okay, that's a fact. I thought he was an idiot. I thought there was something wrong with my father, that he was just dangerous, right? I didn't quite get it, okay? The next time, Rachel's riding her push bike on a main road just across from the family home. I'd left home by this stage, thank Christ. And a friend of my father's ran her over with his car. Happened to be a friend of my father's, ran her over. It's all documented because my solicitor friend represented Rachel in getting a bit of compensation, you know, for her injury. She was really knocked around, okay? So he'd driven over her when she was 5 years old with a car on the front lawn. Then a mate of his runs her over when she's on her push bike on Crossroads, nearly kills her. And then Rachel had to meet this guy at the door while he came over so Rachel could tell him that she'd forgiven him for running her over. Bizarre behaviour, all right? The police know all about this sort of thing. Ruth, my younger sister, was sitting in her car one day and a four-wheel drive crashed straight into the back of her while there were 2 policemen parked watching. And this guy finished up being, he was a solicitor then, he finished up being our Crown prosecutor, Blue. Yeah. And the real strange thing is, it's going to take you a while to take this in, but the investigating officer that came round to see my sister at Macklin Street, not at a police station, was this Chief Inspector Vogelsang's son who joined the police force. Bizarre, okay? Now, Inspector Vogelsang, you wouldn't know this South Australian history, friend of my father's, he ran the whole investigation of the Beaumont children. He controlled the media, he controlled the search, everything was coordinated through him. He was a friend of my father's. And I'm not saying his son was involved in it for one moment, but I know that my friend that I went to school with, he was involved in it, Peter Slade. And him, like, there's a huge list of all of these friends of mine and people that I knew when I was a child who died before they were in their early 20s. Okay? They had accidental death like a bullet through the back of the head, car crashes. One of Anthony Munro's boys crashed his F-111 into the sea off Sydney, I think it was. Yeah, it's my mother, dead, 34. She went to hospital and she was dead 7 o'clock in the morning. She was found dead, died from natural causes. My grandfather died from a bullet wound through his head. My mother's father, my sister Ruth told my mother what happened to the Beaumont children. She died. My mother told her father what Ruth had told her. He finished up dying from a gunshot wound to the head.
Why do you think all these people have been killed?
Because my father needed them to be dead. Simple as that. My father, I can tell you, was a contract killer. He killed people for people in high places. And I will tell you that my 2 sisters and I witnessed our passenger being murdered by our father on a punt, a ferry going across the Murray River when we were kids, okay? We had this guy who was asleep in the back seat. My father was in the front seat and there was a man wearing a suit alongside of him. Everybody that wore suits back in those days, they were usually detectives, the ones that hung around my father. We got onto the ferry. The guy, I'd been drugged, so I was really not 100% with it, but I was still, you know, I was still conscious. The guy winks at my sister because they're talking about how they poisoned him. My father and this other guy are talking about how they gave him enough poison to kill, you know, 10 men or something, but he was still alive. And he winked at my sister, and they stopped the punt in the middle of the river, bashed the punt driver unconscious. I don't know what that was about. And then the guy bolts, he jumps out of the car and dives into the water. My father stripped off to his jockett's pants and he had a knife strapped to the inside of his leg. He dived in, swum after this bloke and stabbed him to death and then dragged him up on the riverbank. Then we were left on the riverbank while they went and disposed of the body. This is the life that I had as a child, and it didn't get any better as an adult, I can tell you. So we're getting into this investigation. We all remember what my father was doing. We all remembered what happened on this day when the Beaumont children went missing. We thought that we only had to go to police and everything would be solved, right? No, that didn't happen. I contacted police and I talked to them, and I talked to Annette Burden, and she arranged for me to go to a Netley police station, which is close to where I lived, to make a statement. They were waiting for me with the handcuffs to arrest me when I got there. More bizarre behaviour. I was sent down to be interviewed where I was being arrested. I speed dialed my solicitor because I'd been in going through a 2-year court battle with my father, and he had a word with the police and said, I know where my witness is. He's a major witness in a major crime, and I know where he is. So they had to let me go. They humiliated me. They indicated I was homosexual because I had a clutch bag that I kept my money and everything in. They tried to humiliate me. It was disgusting. But then we just brought in laws here, terrorist laws, where you could be arrested, taken off the street for 6 months without being able to make a phone call. And that's what they were going for. I almost disappeared, right? And so, but bad luck for them, I carry around a pocket digital recorder, isn't it? I've got 5 of them. They went with me everywhere. I've got like 5 digital recorders. I'm not recording you, of course. Well, we are recording something, but the corruption is just incredible. Now, what happened was I went down to Netley Police Station and I simply said, I would like a couple of 1 or 2 officers to come with me to my family home at Macklin Street. I wish to dig up some bodies, right? Simply could have gone there and dug up the bones that I'd seen buried when I was a child and all the other stuff. And I said, contact Doug Barr. He's the head of major crimes. He sent me down here. He'll confirm it. And Doug Barr ordered that I be arrested and taken off the street for the public safety. That's fact. It's all fact.
Again, why do you think that happened? Why do you think they wanted to get your home?
The big problem for SAPOL is that they had police back in the 50s and 60s that were fiddling with children, right? It's documented in the Mulligan report, and it was finished up on the ABC here on the news. Detectives in groups were going, police in groups were going to the Goodwood orphanage, having tea, and then going up and having sex with the children. That's a fact, okay? That's in the Mulligan report. Now, I'm just lucky I heard it on the news. Otherwise, we're mushrooms here. Nobody else heard about it. So police were going to the Goodwood orphanage and having sex with underage children, right? Now, police were involved in covering up the murder of the Beaumont children. And my father confessed to that, and in front of my son and a friend of his said that he had immunity to prosecution. He had bought his immunity to prosecution with the Beaumont business. And that's been witnessed. You know, it's just awful. And I spent 2 years, I mean, my father was such a devious person that he was given land from his father over on York Peninsula here, where the Beaumont children are buried. And he encouraged my sister Ruth and myself to both build dwelling-sized buildings on his land, stating that we would have that land left to us and our other siblings would get the big property in Adelaide and his other money, so everybody would be looked after. We said, fair enough. He came back from interstate and he took an AVO out on me. That's an aggravate, you know what it is. And that was actually put on me by SAPOL when they didn't even know why they were putting this AVO on me, right? We didn't even find out what that was about for a year and a half later. I spent $40,000 of my money. Not only did I lose my shack and Ruth lost her shack, but my sister Ruth was threatened with being sued $90,000 for so-called damage that they'd done to his land, which is not true. And I had my dwelling-sized building taken away from me. I spent $40,000 defending an AVO put on me by SAPOL, and my father spent between $80,000 and $90,000 trying to keep the gag order on me. He took it to the full bench of the Supreme Court, and that cost him a fortune. I was in the district court, I was in the magistrates court, I was in the Supreme Court, full bench of the Supreme Court over an AVO. I don't have a criminal record. I've never assaulted anybody. I'm not offensive to anybody. I've just been a victim of crime. So it's pretty awful, but it's true.
As a witness, how many deaths have you witnessed?
There's the 2 children that were in the boot of my father's car. I witnessed that, and Ruth, my sister, was there as well. She saw them as well. There were all of the times that it seemed to be towards the end of the week that I'd light up the incinerator. And after I left home, my younger brother had that job, right? It wasn't for some time that we had modern garbage collection here where you put a bin out and it's automatically picked up by an arm and dumped. So prior to about 1980, my father could never get rid of bodies through other means. He kept things on site. Now, my father's been moving bodies around everywhere, and I'll be the person that brings down SAPOL. They're terrified of me. They think they can ignore me and I'll go away, but I won't. I'll let you know I've been working on a site for 6 years. That means driving a long way from where I live, working all night, covering everything up before the sun comes up in the morning. I photograph this. I'm getting into an old mine. I photograph the site. I photograph it when I'm finished because people walk past it all the time. And I can't get to the site at Stansbury. I can't get to the one at Macklin Street, but I can get to this other site down south. Just to let you know, we had a house down here, the first, I don't want to give too much away, but there's a very old house in South Australia. It happened to be the first house ever built. Quite a good structure at the time. I can't tell you too much, but places were named like that in the Middle East. My father's religion and those people that followed him, it was to do with the pharaohs. This is true, to do with the pharaohs, the afterlife, etc., etc. I have a researcher that researches these things for me. I have people that help me that are younger than me that are very good with computers and the internet, etc. And it looks like my father had to collect 100 human heads was his ticket to the other side. We would think that's ridiculous, but these people believed in this stuff. Now, I will tell you something very factual. I've been working with a very frightened retired policeman named John Bartlett, and he wouldn't even like me mentioning his name because his son still works in the police force. He was a mature age cadet at 50, came from another public department or whatever, and he became the head of what we called homicide here in the 80s. Well, probably middle 70s to the end of the 80s or something. He's 80 in his early 80s now. Now, he was head of homicide, and that means investigating murders. He made a request to go down to this house and investigate the people who were there because we know they were doing human sacrifices. They were killing people, sacrificing them and burying them around the place. I'm working on a site at the moment where I may uncover a lot of human remains. I'll keep you informed once I actually get in there. But John Bartlett wanted to investigate these people, and he was ordered by higher ranking policemen than himself that he was not allowed to go near the place. He was not allowed to speak to anybody. He wasn't allowed to investigate, and he investigated murders. That was his job, right? That's John Bartlett. Now, John Bartlett's the guy that actually got me into the Mulligan inquiry. Ted Mulligan made a request, an order that I be interviewed by the police. It took me 10 years of harassing them before I got my interview. 10 years. In the meantime, I gave them stat decks. We have given them hundreds of pages of evidence of my father's activities. They know everything. I know we're jumping around the place, but when I finally got my interview, it was because I was involved in the Anthony Munro prosecution with another bloke who's become a good friend of mine. And we blackmailed the police into interviewing me because I said, if you don't interview me, I'm going to, pardon the expression, spill my guts to the media, right? And I have media people, I have their names, their cards. They wait for me to tell them something, but I do interviews in front of the court, right? And went Australia-wide. And so they had to interview me the day before. So I'd been asking for an interview since the early 2007, late 2006, when they were supposed to interview me late 2006. And it took me until last year to be interviewed. The interview was extensive. They wanted to know, they asked questions, which we won't go into at the moment. I gave them what they wanted. And then the next day, I met my go-to person with a brief of my stat decks and evidence, and he refused to accept it. He would not take it. He would not take my evidence. And while I was there, the other officer said, oh, you know, we could just take your statement and go around the corner and burn it. And I thought, well, that's not very funny. But both of those believed me, but nothing's happened. I have not had a follow-up interview about the statements that I made. No, very serious statements. Very serious statements.
So did you give statements to the Mulligan inquiry?
I didn't personally. My sister Ruth did.
I did too.
And Rachel to the Mulligan inquiry.
And you said last year you gave statements. Who were the statements to?
I've given statements to SAPOL for the last 10 years in stat decks. I've given them lots of evidence. Nothing happens. Nothing happens here.
It was finally Major Crime Department who interviewed Andrew, and he'd been asking for that interview for 10 years.
So despite the seriousness of the allegations that you've made, there's nothing about them?
Nothing's happened. They just think they can keep ignoring the witnesses. You have to realise that most of the witnesses have died of old age or they've been murdered. I'll send you over my stat decks. You'll be gobsmacked that these are legal statements. I could be prosecuted for lying in a stat deck. They're very serious. That's why I do them. I don't embellish. I've never lied.
Do you think the Mullig inquiry got to the bottom of what happened to children in state care?
It established that they disappeared, but my sisters and I know what happened to them. Now, there's a group of people in England who are looking for their stolen generation. It's a big secret over here, but there was a documentary done over there and a movie in England about the children that disappeared after the Second World War. They were stolen by our orphanages here, and because we do our research, and they had parents, they had relatives, relations, and they were just taken out of the country because we needed little slaves over here. It's terrible. And when their parents came over looking for them, they disappeared. They couldn't find them. They couldn't find them because my father had killed them. I know where the bodies are, and mark my words, they will be exhumed. My father, the house he built in Edwardstown, because I'm smarter than SAPOL. I go and get aerial photographs I worked out by myself that after the Second World War, there was a lot of photographic equipment floating around being given away. And all of the councils by 1949 grabbed these high resolution cameras and started flying them around in Cessnas, etc. So I went back to 1949 before my father built on the block. And there was a hole in the ground where he built the house. And you know what he did there? He got timber from an old jetty and uprights, and he put a false ceiling in and built a house over the top. So he had an underground room underneath the house where he'd store where he'd abduct children and then torture them, witnessed by Rachel here and other siblings. He also had, you can sell, and my siblings have told me about the bomb shelter that's underneath the big shed. And what it was, in the Second World War, beginning of the Second World War, there was this big factory called Wunderlich's Tiles and made bricks, etc. And if the Japanese came down, I know this is ancient history, you had to have a bomb shelter. So it wasn't built where the factory was, it was actually built where my father's house is. An underground room, substantial, and it has tunnels leading off from it going all over the place. So people could come down and head through these tunnels and finish up where my father's shed is now. Now he and all his other pedophile mates have used these tunnels. Even today, there are still children being abused through this network because I now deal with a new generation of mothers and that had their children taken away from them in our system here called the foster child system, and Rachel knows who they are, but it's not stopped. They are still networking and accessing children now. They can no longer do it through the orphanage. We had to close our orphanages down to stop this behaviour, and now it's done through the child guardian system here. And they're passing another law soon so they can lose these children. You move them through the system and you change their names until eventually they're completely lost. That's a fact. And I don't specialise in that. I'm the Beaumonts and early family murders, because my father was involved in all of the family murders here through the 70s. He was the body boy. He was the one whose job it was to get rid of the bodies, right? But at a certain point, and this is the conversation he had with my sister Ruth, that he was losing control of them. They were doing silly things. They were making up their own. They were not following my father's instructions, his younger followers. So he started leaving the bodies out. Okay? Richard Kelvin was one of the first bodies that was left out. Richard Kelvin, I knew the Kelvins. You don't know them, but it's a fairly famous abduction here. These people were linked with our family. Went out to tea with them. Their son's going to my auntie's daycare, working at my auntie's daycare centre, my father's sister. Next thing, he disappears and he's murdered. There's a connection with our family everywhere. We're connected to so many murders and people that have disappeared. It's not funny. You know, I mean, it's just the way it is. The police will not do anything. They will not go and look at Macklin Street. They refuse to dig up the well at Stansbury because they're terrified that there'll be 3 other children in the hole. I might find 3 of those children where I'm digging at the moment. I was contacted before the Castorloy dig here. Would you know any of our history about the Castorloy dig? For years, people have thought that the Beaumont children were buried at a site owned by a Phipps who apparently appears to be a pedophile, but I'm not saying he is because I don't want to be sued. He's already dead. I was contacted from interstate, from a journalist from Sunrise, that's Channel 7 Sydney. He said, Andrew, what's your opinion on the Castorloy dig? And I said, there will not be anybody there because they can't be in 2 places at once. They're at Stansbury. And I was right. All they found in the hole was a horse, a dead horse. Somebody buried a horse there, right? But SAPOL spent $254,000 on that dig, but they won't touch Macklin Street. All they have to do is go with me to Macklin Street and I'll start digging the people up for them. All they have to do is lift off one of the layers of concrete and see where all the holes are. You know, we've got people buried everywhere there. But he went through a period of time where he started retrieving bodies and putting them somewhere else. This site that I'm working on, I'll keep you, it's a real secret, I'll keep you informed. It's taken me 6 years, countless thousands of dollars in fuel and all that sort of thing. I mean, out of my own money in the last 10 years, I reckon I've spent $100,000 of my own money trying to solve this problem. And I'm banging my head against a brick wall because I have a police force that are still covering up the sins of the past. I've spoken to them. I've told them, let's blame it on some dead guys. Let's move on. We need a police force. We can't discredit the police force. We need to move on. This has happened in the past, but it's still happening. It's still happening. Now, there's an organisation here that's deeply entrenched, and I don't know who I'm talking to. I don't know what your religions are, what clubs you belong to or anything, so I'm very careful not to offend anybody. But we have people here that have been in control of this state for a long time, and it may be Australia-wide. It could be Western worldwide. I don't know. But pedophilia is getting worse. It's not getting better. Now the internet's being used and the various government organisations are being used. And I know, because I have desperate people talking to me, women who have their children taken away from them and they're given to the husband or boyfriend who is abusing the children, and nothing's done. These cases will be coming to light. It's all, people are relying on me as the only person who can come up with a body. Now, there's one policeman that knows what I'm doing. He's obviously hasn't dobbed me in. But the other night I was up there with my assistant because I'm too big and I have a few injuries. So I have somebody helping me who's a lot smaller than I am. And the police turned up. We're out in the middle of nowhere. The police turn up, put the spotlight on my car that's parked in the bushes, and then they spent the next 2.5 hours looking for me, going all over the place in the paddocks, down in this town, shining their lights in everybody's windows. And eventually they took off. Well, I spray all my equipment black. So I had to hide everything. I had to bury her alive. I had to leave her in there, seal up the whole mine site, put all the rocks back on, and then drive off and come back an hour and a half later. That's what we're dealing with. But I'll keep you informed.
Okay. Well, Andrew, it seems you have a lot to say.
Well, I do.
Thank you. Thank you. Thank you so far for what you have said in your testimony.
If I were to tell you everything that I know, and it would take a long time, and you will not get through it at this stage. We have correspondence, letters to and from SAPOL over the last 12 years, no more, going right back to the middle 90s. They've left a paper trail. My father's guards, as I call them, have left a paper trail. We have backup. Ruth used to send me her correspondence with SAPOL, and I'd keep it just in case something happened. You know, there's been people that have tried to do this who've got themselves into a lot of trouble.
In fact, Andrew, you know, my sense is you've got decades of information you want to, you know, unload, actually.
I have.
And it seems that, but what you have done, quite remarkably, is give a sense of what's been going on, the abuses, the cover-ups, that there has been inquiries, but the inquiry hasn't gone deep enough. That, you know, even now you're asking investigations, state police are still hiding, they're still covering. You're saying it's getting worse. You've given a sense of all that.
No, when I hear of people's post-traumatic stress over something or other, that's fair enough, but we were traumatized right from when we were babies, okay? Yeah. My sisters have been examined that their injuries that were, my father's terrible. I mean, I won't go into it, but what a horrible thing to do to your own children. How could you? Yeah, how could you? He's the most evil man. He's going to be the most famous serial murderer that Australia's ever seen. And he's all the time had the blessing of SAPOL. Yes. They have protected him right to his death. And it's just disgusting. And as I started off in the beginning of our conversation, I said, my father, even back in the 50s and 60s, networked with the public service. And I mean, right through police, medical, solicitors, psychologists. Now that's a beauty. We'd been given the test when we were little children about, we were encouraged to steal from each other. And I know that I refused to steal my sister's lollies. And so did Ruth. Ruth said, God's watching. Yes. And that freaked the lady out. And as for Claire, she probably stole our lollies. Yes, she was going to get somewhere in life. Well, I think she was sadly murdered. Do you know how my sister finished up? She thought that somebody was going to murder her. She was convinced she was being followed, and she probably was. And about a week or two before her death, she booked herself into hospital for protection. And I rang up and I spoke to the head of her ward, and I said, the only person that she has to worry about is her father. With his medical experience, he will read her chart. Whatever she's on, he'll just dose it up and you won't even know. It'll be an accidental death. And they listened to me, but that's as far as it went. So then she was discharged. She came home, and this is according to her daughter. She was ringing police, begging for protection, because she thought her life was, she was in danger of being murdered because of what she knew. And then she told police about Anthony Munro and her father abducting and murdering the Beaumont children. The next day, she was found dead in her backyard, sitting on the ground with sash cord around her neck, and her neck had been broken. My father digs people up after they're buried or they don't get there, and then he puts them somewhere else. When my sister was buried on top of my mother, they broke the coffin open and she wasn't even in it. and I'm afraid I'm going to find her when I finish digging up this mine site. I'm going to find my mother. That's what I think I'm going to find, as well as children. And my father also took us to a cemetery when we were kids, and he dug up his great-grandparents up on Glenburn Road here. He dug them up, and I went to check it out, and he moved the headstones as well and put them somewhere else. I do my research. And he put my poor sister down on top of the box, on the coffins, because they were both buried together, one on top of the other, and he made ghostly noises, like terrified her, that it was, you know, it was our great-grandparents talking from the grave. How sick's that?
Yeah.
And he had a group of people with him. Now, he took my great-grandparents down to this place and left them on an island and said he put them down there to look after the children. Yeah, well, I think he put my mother down there as well. So it's going to be pretty tough when I break into this place. Well, look, I'll keep doing what I'm doing. I'm not having a good time of it because I don't sleep very well. And I'll tell you, my father's been dead, what?
A bit over a year.
Bit over a year. I have nightmares about him every second night. I'll have a nightmare about my father. But as for Anthony Munro, who abused me when I was a child, I've never dreamt about him in my whole life. A person that raped me when I was a child is not a threat to me, but my father has been such a threat that I cannot sleep of a night time. I have nightmares about all of the stuff that he used to do and the bodies, and it's just terrible. All right.
Well, Andrew Mcintyre, thank you for your testimony to this International Tribunal for Natural Justice. It seems you have you've witnessed abuse over many decades, and trying to get all that done in the time that we have been allocated is going to be next to impossible. What you have done is given us a sense of what's been going on in Australia, in Adelaide, what's been going on with you and what you've witnessed. And also, what's deeply concerning, of course, is the fact that all you're asking for is that the state police just to investigate the burials, for example.
That's correct.
That will be enough for you.
Yes.
But they can't even do that.
No.
So, thank you, Andrew. Thank you.